Hello, and welcome back to Radical Engagements here at Varn. And today I'm doing a risky thing, which is covering an article by someone I'm friends with. Those of you know, Daniel Tutt and I have worked together in a few projects. We don't always agree, but we're always amiable. We have slightly different estimations of Domenico Lacerdo, for example, although mine is not as negative as some people's, but is also not as sanguine as others. I wanted to talk, however, about loser politics, an article that was written for a new magazine called Mufta, but was also released on Daniel's Substack, so I'm going to read it from a Substack, about the parasocial left and MAGA communism. Now, I don't talk a lot about MAGA communism. A lot of people get obsessed with opposing it or obsessed with supporting it. I'm a critic of core nationalism. I am ambivalent about left nationalism in general. My ambivalence is well known and stated, and gone into why. The history of nationalism, something I study pretty well. MAGA communism seems to me to be a left nationalist movement in the imperial core, which is weird, but I do like dealing with socialist history and not treating all the American working class as if they're utterly reprobate. So I have read some of the materials. Also, the American Communist Party is a group that I can't tell how big it is. Its structure is opaque to me, given that it seems like chapters are somewhat autonomous. And there's a lot tied into streaming. And the ideologies of people in it, from Midwestern Marx to Haas, do not always seem to be clearly the same. Midwestern Marx tends to be what one may call Lacerdian Dungist, with a nationalist tinge, maybe bits of Foster and Browderism in there. Haas is a mixture of all kinds of things. There's Heidegger, there's the CCRU, there's Marxist-Leninism. There even seems to be bits of Bordiga. So do with that what you will. So I don't like talking about something that seems to be more of a vibe than something I can analyze. And there's at least 2 or 3 ideologies that are in coalition with each other that make it up. But I want to talk about this article because it's interesting to me. The market is based on a zero-sum game logic, according to which the world is split between winners and looters. That's the first statement Daniel makes. Now, I'm going to be a pedant here. I know that when Daniel says the market, he means capitalism and its current neoliberal instantiation in America. However, markets are not necessarily zero-sum. There is always trade-off in markets, so there's always a winner and some losers, but there's not always zero-sum winners and losers. However, today, in our current form of capitalism, which is based on generating profits, not just at all costs, all capitalism is about generating abstract value, thus profits at all costs, but generating profits immediately at all costs is a particular instantiation of capitalism that we have today. It's very short-termist, and it is zero-sum. Absolutely. I mean, and it's zero-sum for the stakeholders. It's not even zero-sum for the business, which means the bourgeois, the stakeholder, and the business, the productive capital, are separated from each other in a primary way, which I think leads people to divide capital up into finance and productive capital. There is some truth to that, but honestly, the parasiticizing nature of today's capitalism goes beyond just the difference between finance and productive capital. Sometimes finance capital actually does leverage time in a way that actually increases productivity. It doesn't right now. In fact, the opposite is true. But markets are not inherently zero sum. However, I know that Daniel means the market as a stand-in for our market in our instantiation of capitalism. So let's go back. The crudeness of this logic shapes our political culture. Absolutely, it does. Because one of the reasons why I think it shapes our political culture is it shapes the media landscape in which our political culture is in. And when you talk about the media landscape as a superstructure, it is. But one must remember that it also sets the terms, along with law, of relations of production, which are in the base. Now, we also have to remember that the base and superstructure is a model. It's not an absolute. But even in the model, it is a feedback loop, because the superstructure informs the base by setting the relations of production and reinforcing them. So this idea that the superstructure is ephemeral is wrong. It's not a good reading of what Marx and Engels are trying to say with that model. Back to the text. According to the discourse of the right, the liberal left is made up of people who cannot face up to reality that they are losers in the world. Although, interestingly, the right often are lower down on the economic totem pole than left liberals. If you look at the stats on it, the right tends to be middle-class petite bourgeois. Liberals tend to be professionals. In the earning curve of things, liberals tend to actually have slightly higher earnings, although they are also more likely to be employees. And that dichotomy has led a lot of people to theorize new class structures and this, that, and the other. I think we have to deal with the fact that cartelized professionals exist. And if you try to say that like the PMC is cartelized professionals from credentialization, then you have to deal with the fact that it means 40% of wage earners are in the PMC and only 15% are in logistics and production. And if and even if you add in service sector, you're still only dealing with like 30%. So it's not that clear. Plus, a lot of people have the credentials, aren't working jobs that require them. So it's not clear as either a method of income or as a relationship of productions, which is why I am hesitant to call it a class. I do think, however, that elite capture is a real social phenomenon, even within classes. And that's something that Marxists have a hard time dealing with, because we deal with the overarching structure of the economy. But the structures within the economy that are often caused by alienation within the economy make it hard to articulate divisions within, broadly speaking, the wage earning class or the working class. Now, we could go into what makes someone proletariat or not, and that has to do with relationships to productive property. And I say productive property on purpose. Owning a house and house values is really not always productive property, particularly if you have to live in it. Now, if you're renting it out, it's a rent and you become a rentier. So, anyway, I'm going on a long rant on Marxist Political Economy 101. But when Daniel says who are too weak to accept the market's logic. So we've seen the market take on this move from the idea that the market enriches all, which was the narrative of Fordism and even the narrative of early neoliberalism. But there is a way when Nietzsche gets incorporated into post-Marxism after the frustrations that a lot of the Marxists had with the Marxist parties in France and in Italy in the 1970s, and a lot of those frustrations were well-founded. See the relationships between the French Communist Party and the Mitterrand government. One can see this incorporation of right-wing ideas that really goes back to people who were kind of not coherently anything like Bataille. Was Bataille a leftist or Bataille a rightist? It's really hard to say. I mean, we might just say Bataille was kind of nuts. And I like Bataille. He was very smart, but it's hard to characterize him as consistently left or right wing. He flirted with both fascism and Marxist Leninism in different parts of his life. So, anyway, back to this. So, popular rhetoric on the right chastises soft snowflakes on the left who are too weak to accept the Marxist logic, even though left liberals often are more privileged. And this actually even shows up in the right's complaining about them. Now, a smarter critique from the right is that left liberals are often actually enacting noblesse oblige to assuage their consciousness while still benefiting from the current system. And that would probably be fair. I might even agree with that. But it's not because the people on the left are snowflakes. Actually, in my opinion, most Americans are kind of snowflakey. We are easy to take umbrage because we use umbrage as a way to get ahead in our culture because our school systems and our legal systems are actually based on that logic. So we are incentivized to take umbrage. The victim mentality that rightists often complain about, they also engage in. So it's something to think about. Okay, back to Daniel's text. I've only gotten 3 sentences in, and we're already 11 minutes into this. This also helps explain another canard of the right, that everyone to the left of them is somehow communist because they want a world of acceptance and affirmation of all people. I mean, I want arbitrary distinctions to be thrown away, and I would accept a whole damn lot, but I don't know that I want acceptance and affirmation of all things and all people. Come on. All right. But this image of the left is a total fantasy. Yep. Thank you. We live in a time when the establishment left of the Democratic Party has no problem affirming the very same worldview of political winners and political losers. This is evident in the 2024 election cycle when Joe Biden referred to Trump's followers as trash people. A phrase as tone deaf as when Hillary Clinton called Trump's movement a basket of deplorables in 2016. To many liberals, the political coalition of misfits and losers that Trump has assembled are thought to possess an intractable resentment over the loss of their cultural hegemony. You hear this about mediocre white men who are declining in society while ignoring the problems of like the entire working class, which is often thrown as white, although it's not. It's actually slightly more of color than the general population, but general population is a lot more white than both leftists and whiteists seem to pretend that it is actually. So that's actually kind of an interesting thing to think about. But the resentments of Trump's base are rarely discussed from the lens of economic deprivation. They are sometimes, but then liberals yell at people who do it. So, without an analysis of the economic and class inequities that drive the resentment of Trump's base, liberalism only exacerbates the myth of the political loser. And weirdly, I've only seen like one liberal who's popular address this, and that's like Ronnie Chang, the comedian on The Daily Show. In general, it's college professors at elite institutions talking about the privilege of people who are much lower on the social hierarchy than them, while they benefit from having an army of adjuncts under them doing most of the work while they do research. Just not to say the research isn't viable, but it doesn't reach out to most people and is safeguarded by elite institutions that make it very expensive to access, even though a lot of it's paid for by tax dollars. So yeah, the ironies of this that sometimes conservatives rightly point out is pretty legitimate, but they have no problem talking about winners and losers. Without an analysis of the economic and class inequities that drive the resentments of Trump's base, liberalism only exacerbates the myth of the political loser, and they strive on it. Really, this can only lead to more and more communities continuing to sprout up that organize according to this unacknowledged logic. Well, I mean, you respond to the incentives of your society. Yeah. The politics of the loser points to a deeper contradiction of liberalism on both the left and the right. Namely, the winner-loser dichotomy creates an immense subjective alienation. Yeah. Now, in early Marx, now this is not systematized, but if you read the political economic manuscripts, it's pretty clear there are 4 forms of alienation. Alienation of the worker from the labor, alienation of the worker from their society, alienation from the worker from their own class through interclass competition, and alienation of the worker from themselves because of the bottom 3 forms of alienation. All right. Now, Marx never systematizes it that clearly. That's my systemization, but it's pretty clear that's what he talks about. Marx does talk about, for example, interclass competition being a block for the class for itself, because and there's real needs for interclass competition because you really are in competition with other workers. This contradiction was on full on display in the high-profile debate between right-wing philosopher Jordan Peterson and erstwhile left provocateur Slavoj Žižek in 2019. Peterson's widely popular brand of bootstrap libertarian self-help, which has only got more mystified since 2019, it's gotten weirder and weirder. And the individual initiative appeal quite naturally to the basement dweller, to incel, and other cliche manifestations of the loser. The loser doesn't want to be a loser, and they want reasons to get out of it. This is Varn talking, but this is actually a very important thing to notice. And also, modal politics that don't fall into the mainstream of society, always attract marginalized people, and not just marginalized groups, the holy grail and synthesis of liberal politics, but marginalized individuals, people who are even marginalized from their own personality or disability or any number of things. And most people can fall into that category at some point in their life. When you look at it in terms of the individual, there's always a chance to be marginalized. An individual is always standing somewhat alone unless they command the resources of other people. Although he is highly contradictory champion of Marxism, I'm not sure that I would consider Zizek a Marxist, actually. His Marxism includes a rejection of labor theory of value, are even discussing the critique of labor theory of value in its classical form in Marx. It involves a rejection of materialism as not understanding that materialism and idealism are really the same thing, because the shift between energy and form is actually hard to state. Now, as a person who has very complicated metaphysics, I'm somewhat sympathetic to that, but I still think it's kind of avoiding the problem of materialism. Nonetheless, Zizek championed a left that would be capable of organizing the same mass of alienated contingent of young men. Well, that is who mostly the radical left appeals to. Now, if you go to the activist, NGO, local community left, there's a lot of women in it. But if you go to like the average DSA meeting, despite what you see in the leadership, it's probably going to be 70% men. That's been my experience in several chapters. And there are women there, but not a huge amount. He acknowledges that the left has struggled to integrate the political loser, and that his objective was to turn Peterson's fans to the left, which I don't think was a great idea. I also don't think we should abandon them. Obviously, there's a lot of people who are rejecting left liberal values and even left-wing values who are working class. And we should appeal to those people. I don't really do it here. This is not really the place to do it. But I would also say that there's a danger of tailism here. Now, when I say tailism, I do not mean trying to meet the people where they are. And a lot of people think that's what I mean by it. What I mean is trying to hide your politics by appealing to politics that you don't actually believe in to get people to get with you as a method of meeting people where they are. But people won't trust that. Most people do actually see through it. All right, back to Daniel's text. After all, the Marxist insights into class conflict can help challenge the winner-loser vision, revealing it as a total fantasy. This fantasy is revealed precisely in the notion that for Marx, class is a relation, not a fetish. I mean, a fetish is a stand-in for a relation, so the fetish is always potentially there. But class is not a thing. It is a relationship, and it's a relationship specifically to the production of society into social reproduction. And when you talk about social reproduction, you're also talking about stuff that the left often doesn't talk about, such as dating and children and child rearing and stuff like that. All right. And thus, class power does not function as a personification of the elite or the oligarchs. Yeah, that was my point earlier. Elite and oligarchs exist, sometimes even within the class. And I know people aren't comfortable with that people want to pretend the class is equal in itself, but Marx doesn't think that. Marx actually talks about income not being the thing that they're primarily even concerned about all the time. Although if you had radical power egalitarianism, which is the implication of trying to remove arbitrary barriers in class, then a lot of these things won't happen as severely anyway, because there's no way that people are consenting to that unequal of a relationship. The ruling class is not a personification of some aristocratic cabal. Well, at least not in capitalism. They are in some societies, actually, but not here. They are personification of the whims of capital. The whims of capital is an interesting thing, because that's an abstraction that emerged from the logic of capitalist production. Although people do instantiate capitalist production, we shouldn't forget that. Marx's insight into class tempers the liberal tendency to individualize social conflict. And think about social conflict when liberals talk about it. Liberals often refer to like checking your privilege. Well, privilege is not something that you have that much control over. So they're asking you to change your relation to something that you didn't set up, even if you benefit from it as an individual, and as if that's going to deal with the fundamental problem, which it absolutely doesn't. I do think we're finally seeing this rhetoric and strategy kind of die down. I hear a lot less of it, but it's been a dominant trend for about a generation. From the end of Gen X through most of the millennials, that was the liberal framework, was privilege, going all the way back to Peggy McIntosh's article from the 80s that she wrote for education class called the Invisible Knapsack article. And there's privilege discussions going way back before that, but that's really when it really takes on cachet in left liberal circles. And one of the things about that checklist, if you go through it, it actually pretends that like white people don't have economic differences that are blockers, or that it seems to think that economic differences are legitimate. All right. This individualizing tendency leads to political communities that are constantly caught up in seeking a resolution to the alienation that the liberal system of class exclusion has brought on in the first place. This is a vicious cycle of capitalist politics, cannot escape the winner-loser myth. I mean, the winner-loser myth is a particular instantiation of this form of capitalist politics. I would actually argue that capitalist politics doesn't always take on this as an ideological justification. Fordist capitalist politics, which is a groundwork for neoliberalism, and I know people are always shocked when I say that, but it is. It set up the public-private partnerships where then the working class was removed from the table. But it was and is in a very fundamental way. It has moved to this zero-sum game mentality because that's the way a lot of this particular instantiation of market logic works. Not even the businesses are winners anymore. You're not even getting a profit, a product always from the profits. You're getting pure rating. All right. Anyway, back to this. This cycle gives way to a politics of resentment that marks a blemish on the liberal politics. It really undoes liberal justifications of itself and fundamental values. There is no more important, if not provocative, thinker of resentment than Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche places the problem of resentment at the center of his wider theory of crisis of political values ushered in modernity. By modernity, he argues, is shaped by a movement of leveling from socialism to egalitarian Christianity to the revolutionary ideas of the French Revolution. The social forces and values of massification and the demands for equality, rights, justice, and so on are thought to be driven by feelings of revenge among the lower classes. Nietzsche argues that these forces agitate to remove the very split in society that defines the contemporary liberal idea of the winner-loser split, an idea that Nietzsche wishes to defend. Although we got to be very clear about this, Daniel. Nietzsche wishes to defend this on pre-modern terms. He does not like the marketization of ideas. I mean, God dies in the marketplace, and thus spoke Zarathustra for a reason. He is an aristocratic anti-capitalist, even though he wasn't an aristocrat himself, which is all the more ironic the more you know about Nietzsche's biography. He argues that while political resentments must be overcome, this must be achieved by forging a political community that can form the social life that is constituted by the winner-loser dynamic. Amor fati, you must love your fate. If you're a loser, you should love being a loser. And if you can't strive, you should be crushed. That is Nietzsche's logic. The problem with modern egalitarian movements, in his view, is that they obscure a natural set of differences, and a political operation must be enacted so that a truer ascending and descending line within humanity can be located and affirmed. Now, I'm going to point out, this is anti-liberal logic. Liberal logic is based off of nominal egalitarianism. But the demands of the market increasingly undo that. While I don't believe in techno-neo-feudalism because robots aren't mining your food yet and someone actually has to produce the food, you don't live off tokens on the internet, and also the internet's not without massive amounts of physical infrastructure that require real physical people to really physically put it together and maintain it, which somehow people talk about as if that isn't true because they only deal in the part that they interact with, which is, the screens I'm moving my hand around right now, which is not that much infrastructure, but there's a massive infrastructure hidden from me of which I am taking advantage to give this to you. So we always have to remember that. And that infrastructure is maintained by massive amounts of power, massive amounts of human production and capital, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We aren't in a feudal infrastructure in that commodity production really does still drive even the basis of the infrastructure for these non-commodity sources of profits and rents. But, and this is a big but, the government and whatnot is a lot more involved in who wins and who loses. Anyway. And I think it's interesting because while I reject techno-neo-feudalism, I see why people believe it, because in this phase of capital that we are currently in, there is no longer the ideological justification of the oblige. Now, that might be because there's no Soviet Union anymore. China is more integrated into the global market, although that may be unraveling and through decoupling. A decoupling that China didn't initially want, by the way, but it's been forced upon it, and that it's enforcing back because it has the power to do so. But I want to talk about this a little bit more thoroughly, right? Because the reason why people feel like they're in a neo-feudal vision is because the veneer that capitalism is not zero-sum has just been totally removed, and they aren't even hiding it anymore. Even early neoliberals like to pretend that everyone would benefit from the efficiency of adding layers of middlemen. That never made sense to me, even as a kid. And whatnot, because government was incompetent. It didn't have a monetary check. Now, I find that funny because state governments have more monetary checks, in my experience, because they actually have to tax for what they spend, than what I experienced when I worked for a large corporation, which could go to venture capital and insurance to get more capital when it wanted to do things, even if it didn't have the money itself. Nonetheless, that's, that is often left out of this equation, but they do eventually have to be profitable, or at least profitable on paper. And that's an important distinction. Okay, although contemporary liberals will think of their wider political vision in such terms, they share in common with some of the most reactionary elements of Nietzsche's political thought. basically, this winner-loser dichotomy that Daniel is pointing out, because of the advanced state of alienation that we exist in, is something that leads to an incorporation of earlier political thought. And if you read the Brumaire, Marx talks about this. Now, I don't believe in unilateral progress. I think of thinking of progress as something we're always moving from and towards in terms of morality or politics is nonsense. But I do believe if you look at set values or virtues that people said they believed in, you were moving closer or farther away from a clear definition of that. And in terms of the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity solidarity, as espoused by the original French Revolution, or even the terms of the American Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, we are moving further and further away. And in that sense, we are regressing by the standards that the societies use ideologically to justify what they're doing. So even from the abstract contradictory values that we don't really lay out and explain as political virtues in liberalism, we are moving further and further away from that, which is why it's easy for all sides to call each other illiberal liberals. And there's some truth to it. Nietzsche is one of the most important intellectual allies to the liberal order because his political thought supports the winner-loser mythology. Basically because Nietzsche brings back a pre-modern notion of winners and losers without any of the social responsibility justifications that are in other forms of conservative and reactionary thought. Most class collaborationist or class functionary or medievalist, or, I say medievalist because not because medieval is like a clear category, but people who idolize the medieval world believe that the classes have responsibilities to one another. Right? Now, that's usually, in hindsight, it's created usually as a political myth later. Chivalry was created as a myth that thought the nobles from killing all the peasants that actually produced the food. That sort of thing. But Bushido and the chivalry codes actually come after the periods that they're talking about, and they tend to be retrojected onto the past to kind of come for a set of duties for elites and something for them to do. And they're never truly and totally instantiated, but they do exist. Nietzsche's political vision of winners and losers, there's no responsibility of the winner to the loser at all. That is something you need to notice. And that is clear when you read Genealogy of Morals or Thus Spoke Zarathustra. At the heart of Nietzsche's political thought is a community-building objective in which the liberal mythology of the winner-loser society is affirmed by an Übermensch that actively shapes the world, in which the descending and ascending lines of humanity are affirmed. Now, I find it interesting that Daniel insists that this is liberal. I think, fundamentally, Nietzsche is an anti-liberal thinker, but that this instantiation of liberalism, for a variety of reasons, more than ideological even, I think some of it has to do with the nature of how hard it is to make money off of just plain old commodities anymore. Which leftists themselves will try to argue with you about, but it's pretty clear that the actual value of real commodities is declining, particularly the ones you need the most. And the things that we depend on are turned into rents, and that's why they're expensive. Which is why, for example, luxuries, which are based on material goods, are often cheap, but people want to turn them into rents as much as they can because otherwise they're going to get too cheap. So you see the downward pressure on the cost of music, for example, leads to stuff like Spotify, which has totally destroyed the music industry. This is another one of those self-cannibalization things. But it changed it into rents. that someone can collect who isn't the producer of the music nor the consumer. It's actually pretty good for the consumer on a month-to-month basis, but probably isn't in the long term. They probably actually spend more money than they would have had to have a modest music collection. But since you're paying for it monthly, you don't notice. All right. Anyway, so those kind of things lead to a more winner-loser mentality. Now, you can't completely strip the base of society because then they can't even afford the rents. But nonetheless, you see this in the fact that businesses are less and less concerned with even generating good products of the long-term sustainability of the business. They're concerned solely with generating profits for the stakeholders because the bourgeoisie are so abstracted that they're even abstracted from the success of the businesses themselves. They're purely tied into the stock market. All right. The philosopher Peter Sloterdijk has argued that there is a danger implicit to the Nietzschean call to affirm oneself above the herd, and that it has been a source for reactionary and fascist community building. Yes. This is the elitism for everyone that you see in everybody from Anne Land to Casa Pound. Sloterdijk does not blame Nietzsche directly for the rise of 20th century fashion because he's not the fault. No individual thinker causes a social movement quite like that. Marx didn't call socialism either. Right? He rather claims that fascism is a movement of losers who effectively abuse Nietzsche's insight for the purposes of ascending to the top. Basically, they use Nietzsche to do what Nietzsche accused Christians of doing. And by Christians, he also meant Jews. Although Nietzsche had a weird relationship to anti-Semitism because Nietzsche also thought the anti-Semites were also losers who were using the hatred of Jews to get to the top. But nonetheless. For Sloterdijk, fascism is a movement of losers who usher in a top-down world, and thus Nietzsche's elitist community poses a fatal risk to the liberal order because it can be easily be co-opted. In our age of extreme class stratification and inequity, the winner-loser myth is a near inescapable common sense on both the political right and left. Now, why is that? And I do think Robert Brenner had a point when he said that the government is more and more involved in picking the winners and losers because government contracts are more and more important because you need more and more rents. And to get rents, you need police to enforce them. The thing about rents is if you're not selling a physical product, someone's got to enforce that rent for you. And that requires at least the implicit threat of some kind of violence. Political communities often sprout that openly embrace the winner-loser myth to confront the resentment and alienation of capitalist society. To internalize the winner-loser myth is to affirm a natural society governed by aggression and resentment. This is why a psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion points out in his studies on groups, which I'm rereading that book. It's pretty good, although it's kind of out of date. Political communities form to allow members to flee this sense of persecution. Modal groups create strong bonds. This is why marginalized communities actually often have stronger internal communities than majority ones, because they're strong bonds to resist a sense of persecution, particularly when the persecution is real. But even if it's not real, you need the experience of it to back it up. In his experiences in groups, Bion describes a similar logic of group belonging, in which he calls the fight-flight group. Here, a group of members identify with a leader by forming a dependency structure that is violent and exclusive. The emergent fight-fight group affirms the zero-sum logic of the capitalist market interior to the group, aka there's so much fighting within the group that this kind of dog-eat-dog competition for, let's say, trade and social status actually mirrors a zero-sum market. But because it's within the group, it seems to be pushing against the outside mainstream, which is the same thing. It's not perceived as being as bad. A lot of cults work this way. All right, anyway. But it does so on terms that are perceived as fairer and more satisfying than the mainstream groups because they're smaller and you stand much more of a chance, such as the school, the church or churches, or the army. Actually, the army is not really a fight-fight group. It's both rigidly hierarchical and egalitarian at the same time. Anyway, in fight-flight group, The leader plays a role of forming an artificial environment in which the competition of wider society is reenacted within the group, but on terms that are much more transparent. I added the much, but it's right. So the idea here is you believe that competition is fairer in this weird sub-society or subculture, this grouping, because you know what the rules are. And because it's a smaller group with less complex rules, you perceive it, maybe even rightly, as somewhat more fair, even though it replicates the same kind of competition as general society. This is what Daniel was getting at with his invocation of Bion. Like the Nietzschean community, which affirms the winner-loser myth by active separation and division for those that deemed weak or inferior, the fight-fright group does the same thing. But they rely on a leader to enact the separation from wider society. The fight-fright group thus sustains the winner-loser mythology by rejecting the dominant liberal version and fortifying the community as a perfect alternative to it. Often by appealing to prior kinds of communities that are pre-liberal. What Nietzsche was trying to do, actually. Problems inevitably arise within the fight-fright group because a leader, as the savior figure, takes it upon himself to perform victoriously against a hostile world. The fight of the group thus becomes a reserve of the leader alone, and they leave no room for members to enact their power. Again, you see this in cult dynamics. This results in an inability of the fight-flight group to satisfy the independence of each member, and they become what Bion refers to as a dependent group. A group dependent is formed around a leader whose authority is taken to be benevolent, but who remains the only actor within the group that can confront the hostile outside world. It's basically a form of projection. On a mass scale, this is Bonapartism. And we are particularly given to it. All right, the backlash to liberalism, Gen Z, and the rise of the parasocial left. Okay, let's see where this goes. The alienation brought on by today's rapacious, austerity-driven capitalism has given rise to all sorts of strange political ideology, especially amongst young people. Yep, and this has been actually the case. It was not just the Zoomers who did this. If you were on the internet in the aughts and early teens, there were some weird ideologies that were popular on the internet, but less and less society was pushed into those corners. I think between 2010 and 2020, this really amped up. And I do think that I think that this is too America-centric because this is a worldwide phenomenon. But between Corbyn failing, Syriza failing, Podemos failing, Sanders failing, you see all this build up in some weird ways in the Western capitalist world. All right. The fallout from Bernie Sanders' second presidential campaign in 2020, combined with the zombie-like blunders of the centrist Democratic Party afterwards, even when they were in power, this is me adding it, has contributed to a highly confused series of political ideologies across the online left. Social alienation is not homogenous, but it is shaped by generational and class experience. And generational experience is only important because in our society, access to abstract capital, aka valuation, really does shift generationally. When you enter the housing market, almost as matters as what you buy. Now, that's actually a weird side effect of regulation, believe it or not, but nonetheless. While the millennial generation exhibits the most support for socialism amongst any generation since World War II, asterisk, that's been slightly decreasing on asterisk. This trend can only be understood by recognizing the way that system-wide crises, from 9/11 to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to the 2008 economic crisis, have uniquely disenchanted the millennials with status quo liberalism and capitalism. In 2024, in 2004, thank you. My aphasia really affects numbers. The millennials were predicted to be a more conservative generation to Gen X, which seems laughable now. But if you think about the differences in what happened, and it's not Gen X's conservatism, which is, again, generations are confusing, but Gen X's conservatism probably comes from the fact that came into property late, compared to boomers and silent gen and greatest generation. They're poorer than baby boomers and silent generation. Gen Xers are going to start retiring soon, and they're fucked. But they did get into property and whatnot, and what they lived through was Atari Democrats, the fall of the Soviet Union, most of the worldwide revolutions of national liberation being religious, not economic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there's a big difference from coming up in the period where Saqqara seems to be dominant and coming up in the period when the Islamic Republic of Iran seems to be dominant, because the motivating ideologies are quite different. But what of the current youth generation, the Zoomers? Theirs is an experience of life fully immersed online. They do not know a life before institutional austerity and cutthroat competition. To be fair, neither do millennials. To be a millennial is to be born in a period after Fordism. The difference is, I think, is that the social institutions that, even though they were being neoliberalized during my lifetime, they were still more robust than they are now. And the escape from that is more isolated. There's less, even television is less and less social. And television is a passive form of entertainment. But you've even seen, the interactivity of the internet becoming less and less social and more parasocial over time. The changes in social media actually reflect this. Think about the differences between interactions with your friends on LiveJournal or Facebook versus interactive with randos that come up by algorithm on TikTok or Instagram. All right. Not only have Zoomers come of age amongst rapacious post-2008 economic conditions marked by austerity and the rising cost of living, the two major political events that shaped their lives were the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and the COVID pandemic in 2020, as opposed to the Afghan wars and 9/11, are for baby boomers the Vietnam War and the Nixon scandal. Both events bore witness to the liquidation of the left, just like in the Generation X. I actually talked about that while we can overstate generational cycles, that there is a real rhyming between the worldwide fallout of the left that the Gen X saw in the 80s and the individual fallout of lefts nationally that Zoomers have grown under. And it was the fallout of Bernie Sanders' movement which proved to be particularly damaging, given he was a figure that many Zoomers passionately supported. There's evidence for that. Although Zoomers are now less likely to be progressive than millennials. And not that I think that's great. I mean, I don't feel one way or the other. I don't like progressivism. I'm a Marxist, not a progressive. On the older end, Zoomers are now reaching their late 20s and early 30s in an economy that has blocked their capacity to reproduce their families, so to purchase a home, even though it's better. They keep on hearing the economy is good, but they can't do anything that their parents told them they should have been able to do. Although millennials couldn't do it really either, and they're just beginning to do it now in their 40s. Let alone without massive debt from college or from housing. I mean, housing is a massive debt. Fucking cars are a massive debt now. Right. And we don't, and unlike in Europe, before Europeans come here, we don't have the intercity public infrastructure, and we're a huge country where you can just go it out. Right? It's one thing to have car shares in Norway. It's another thing in the United States, particularly once you leave the East Coast, where there's often 3 to 8 hours between a city if you're driving 70 miles an hour. All right, I'll convert it to kilometers eventually for our European friends. For those who remain politically active, Zoomers tend to forge their political engagement online. And as Emma Frost documents, their political ideologies are highly odd and contradictory. Yeah, I've had Joshua Chinchilla come on and talk about this too. For the more politically active Zoomers, it is common to hear them label their politics third positionism or anti-democratic transhumanism. Third positionism, by the way, is fascism. That's just a code for fascism, and anti-democratic transhumanism is, I don't know. whatever Nick Land beats off to. This incoherence signals a restless radicalism that is driven primarily by institutional alienation and the long-term fallout from the sabotage of the Sanders movement. I mean, the Sanders movement, it's not just a sabotage of the Sanders movement. The Sanders movement also liquidated itself into the Democratic Party, Daniel. I think we do have to admit that. Young people today are rightly rebelling against the existing left and liberal institutions, from the NGO network of civil society groups to nonprofits to the various Democratic Party subsidiaries, such as the Democratic Socialists of America. And yep, until that left of the Democratic Socialists of America actually get it to break its ties to the Democratic Party, that's going to continue to be a problem. But if it does break those ties, how does it not just become another sect? I don't know. There's a profound trust barrier and legitimacy crisis that these organizations have rightly developed, and many young people feel that their frameworks the left offers for the social change has proven inadequate. I mean, because they associate the left with the Democrats and progressives, and that is inadequate. All right, added to this legitimacy crisis, the leading left and liberal institutions reflect an exclusive upper middle class culture that seeks to care nothing for the struggles of everyday workers. You know, it's people who shame people for the words they use while buying stuff that are made by people human trafficked into Alabama. And yes, Virginia, that really does happen. But in a way, I mean, it is interesting how this is both more severe and more localized than it was with Gen X, who went through a similar transition. And I know I'm talking about generations, but we need to talk about generations in terms of class. Like, the generational distinctions, to me, the baby boomer is a generation that's real because it had such wealth in America and in the West broadly, particularly in America, in the United States, that it literally had whole new institutional lives. The modern government that we know at post-World War II was erected. The university system we have today came about from baby boomers. The expansion of the public school system came about from baby boomers. The change in the hospital society we have that came about from baby boomers. And they became more and more privatized over time. And it does seem like elite institutions that are talking about progressive values all the time are really benefiting from things like being the biggest landowners in New York. How many woke professors at Columbia University are slumlords indirectly because they support an institution that is the largest holder of land in New York City? All right, this collapse in legitimacy of the left and liberal institutions is also occurring in the context in which the internet increasingly mediates every aspect of collective social life. This has given rise to an online left populated by micro-communities formed around podcasters, online streamers, and scholars without a proper place in the academic system. I mean, Daniel and I are probably two of those ourselves. You know, this is something Daniel and I are both familiar with. We're both part of it. I do have a whole separate life where I'm part of unions and whatnot, although I'm not as active in my union as I once was, and I'd like to be for a variety of reasons, but still. These micro communities are not marginal or ineffectual. It is more likely an online community will contribute to the shaping of political ideology of Gen Z than the immediate experience of college professors. I mean, who just listens to the college professors and apes them? I try, like my college professors tried to radicalize me. Only one did, and he was a right winger. And that was because he was nice to me. He didn't lecture me in the same way. Not only have the institutions of the left collapsed, or they never existed, a left separate from the Democratic Party, but the university system has grown more and more exclusive and austere. Economic diversity has decreased in the universities in particularly in the academic humanities, asterisk, where the left is dominated on asterisk. In 2004, there are fewer than 5 tenure-track jobs offered in comparative literature, for example, and the growing number of young academics face a job market that is completely dried up. And honestly, the fact that these institutions have to train more than they need to even justify existing is kind of gross. I've compared this. It was not just me. I mean, there's a couple of people I've cited who compared this to the end of the scholastic system of the medieval Catholic university, and I do think we are kind of there. Now, people have said, have taken me talking about like people just not going to school and trying to get into blue collar trades, particularly if they're not getting any training or credentialization, as me saying that the university system is good. Well, you still do actually have better outcomes from going to university so far, even with the debt loads, etc. If you look at the life success for particularly working class men, it's pretty bad. But I've talked about that elsewhere. If you want to see my videos on that, there's a article by Ryan Segraff that I covered on radical engagements at the end of 2024 that covers this pretty thoroughly. In the absence of civil and political associations, micro-communities form around public figures, and this takes on a parasocial quality. Asterisk. This even does in mainstream Democrats. Beto and Cynthia McKinney were never really particularly successful politicians, but they were tried to be astroturfed as a new Obama as a parasocial relation, and it didn't work. But that laid down the groundwork. So these things that you see in Gen Z were already starting in millennials. And they're an extension of things that even began with the boomers. I mean, read the Comments on Society of Spectacle, which I still think is a not perfect text, but it does get into this. Parasocial communities are in many ways more intense than the purely social communities because they are forged in liminal comfort of online spaces. Liminal comfort means you can be highly alienated, but feel like you're not. Right? I can tell you as a person who has gone to things online versus gone to meetings in person and who works online, but also goes into the office on a regular basis, it's different. I'm actually probably more effective at my job at home, but there are times when I need to go in and have that community to actually, and in person, not just collaborating through Zoom, to be able to fully enact like social thought and to get my zones of proximity, to use a Vygotskian pedagogical phrase, where I am learning from the peers around me in an active way. While relationships formed online are typically non-committal and passive, I mean, look at how many people ghost each other. Ghosting friends is something I've noticed with both older and younger people that was unheard of before. Not just even ghosting, relationships. And I find that wild. That is not something that's historically common. Political micro-communities on the left, precisely because the left tends to be composed of people who have themselves been radicalized and experienced alienation from the system. Actually, so is the right. I think the link with the left and alienation needs to be expanded to all modal politics. The right is also highly alienated and highly fractious, tend to form more passionate connections. Passionate but fickle. The power of these parasocial communities should not be underestimated. It is more likely that a person will change their minds about political theory, power, and sociality from exposure from a podcaster in their MAGA communities through experiences with a college professor. But I will say, it is also likely that they'll change it when they find another podcaster, which they wouldn't if they were in a in-person community that had more social responsibilities. And I do think that needs to be addressed in this essay. So micro communities are powerful, but they're fickle. Micro communities are also more than mere education hubs. The leaders can take on roles as spiritual coach as much as intellectual, the rise of the online guru. One of the reasons why I insult my audience so much, it's partly because I'm an irascible bastard, but also partly because I don't want a guru relationship. All right. They provide sense-making, allowing for the development of ideological lens to make a coherent politics of our world, even if they don't really do that. Meme warfareism and the alpha parasocial movement, MAGA communism. Okay. Whew. On the online parasocial left, the MAGA communist typifies the political irrationalism of Gen Z alienated from the existing left. It's not clear whether MAGA communism is a fringe internet movement, as reported by CNN, the New York Times, and reflected in investigative reports on a movement conducted by The Guardian. I think it's interesting that there's so much media interest in MAGA communism, and they never fucking gave that much interest in the DSA. Liberal outlets did to use them, but CNN wasn't like going into them. MAGA communism began as an infrared parasocial community started by Haz el-Din, a Lebanese American law student who dropped out of school in 2019 to preach Marxism full-time on the internet. Haas is not an ordinary influencer in the age of the parasocial left. His message draws support from the same venerable demographics as Jordan Peterson attracts, namely dejected young men, are the figures liberals markedly called the basement dweller. Haas preaches a message that has many of the same qualities as Peterson's bourgeois self-help rhetoric, but he situates this thought there squarely in the Marxist tradition. Asterisk, as read through Heidegger and the CCRU, which is weird. But I'm not going to, In an early period of infrared, Haas built a loyal base following a cage match approach to the wider online parasocial left. One of the things you'll notice about things emerging from then Twitter, now X, is that it had a rap beef mentality, that feuding with other streamers is how streamers got big and got legitimacy. And it led to a very negative kind of engagement that is universal amongst a lot of streamers. I mean, we shouldn't just, it's not just Haas that does this at all. His strategy to approach each day online was a battlefield amongst a wider war to defeat what he names leftism, which he and his followers define as collective ideological tendency of the existing American left. In the founding manifesto of MAGA communism, Haas and Infrared argue that a new metaphysical, whatever the fuck that means, alternative to leftism needs to emerge to usher in a multipolar imperial arrangement of power in which American hegemony is disaligned. I'm going to asterisk this. There's nothing to goddamn do with Marxism. He does, how it seems to have picked up more and more Marxist rhetoric as this developed, though. And he seems to have come from Marxist rhetoric. But there's a lot more Smith and Heidegger in that founding manifesto of MAGA communism than there is anything else. His followers are known as the guerrillas, an homage to their task of making guerrilla warfare on existing leftism, and an admission that their community is centered around the silverback alpha of Haas himself. It's a dependency relationship. Infrared argues that the primary schism of politics is not between left and right. I've heard that before. Thank you, Francis Yaki. But rather is a nascent partisan ideology which draws people into a general antagonism with the status quo and leftism. Not rightism, by the way. Rightism has failed, but it's not bad. Which represents all the expressions of the existing left and which is the total embrace of the status quo. In the manifesto, they write, the distinction between left and right is displaced by the distinction between leftism, which increasingly takes in political reality a form of apolitical center, and partisanship, which includes all matter of eclectic, wild, fringe ideologies which appear all over the political spectrum. Asterisk. You saw this kind of rhetoric also in post-left anarchism of the 1990s with Gen X. I do think that we need to look at the similarities between that and this. The difference is post-left anarchism arose, and some of it went very right-wing actually over time, but arose in the milieu of zines and an alternative punk culture, and particularly in the Pacific Northwest. This is much more diffuse because of the nature of the media. It appears as such, not because of any mystical Nazgul vortex or profound metaphysical significance of fascism, but because it represents, in the final analysis, a denial of the modern political form itself. In contrast to third position syncretism, a partisan political ideologies are properly chaotic, defined only by their unpredictability from the standpoint of the modern political consciousness. That could have almost been read by Bob Black. And for those of you who don't know who Bob Black is, the figures of the marginal politics of Gen X. I'm a Xennial. I'm 44 years old, and I have been involved in both political subcultures, so I can tell you a lot about it. The strategy of MAGA communism is thus to promote a radical hyperstitial disruption from within the MAGA base of followers from whom they see as antagonistic agents capable of disrupting contemporary leftism. I would tell you to read... this was a very similar ideology proposed to by the author Sam Francis of Leviathan and Its Enemies. Now, I'm not saying that MAGA communism is the same as the alt-right. It isn't. But that strategy was proposed by alt-rightists and the radical fringe of paleoconservatism in the past. You can make of that what you will. I know some of those movements. I was even tangentially involved with some of them. So it's something that I think you should look up. And I understand the appeal of this kind of thinking. This was very attractive to me in my 20s as a millennial, as a Gen X millennial, as a zennial. But this idea that the inside onion of Trump MAGA movement is the beating heart of American proletariat leads infrared to positions that effectively tail the Republican Party, which, of course, is just a mirror image of leftists tailing the Democrats, particularly movement Democrats and progressives, which I think we should distance ourselves from, as well as we should distance ourselves from Republicans. We should be our own thing. This is precisely because so much of the content of their political controversies revolves around the embrace of the very same cultural war positions that mainstream Republican Party champions. Most instrumentally, this cultural war pandering to the right leads infrared to adopt narrow empirical definitions of what constitutes the working class. Actually, not even empirical definitions. They're including large parts of the petite bourgeoisie as part of the working class, which some of them do, is not an empirical definition, leading them to deny, for example, that baristas or servant workers are part of the proletariat. So I guess they want their movement base to be 13.5 to 15% of the population. But that's not the people they appeal to, because a lot of the people they appeal to don't have logistics jobs. And that's true for MAGA Republicans too. It's something to be invoked as an image of the past. But despite these basic contradictions in its understanding of the working class in MAGA, infrared's core problem is that it only measures the success and performance of its leader. In his bio, Haas curiously describes himself as a comedian and the undefeated tanky warlord. Haas hosts nightly streams for loyal fans, falling between 600 and 1,000 guerrillas, consisting of lighthearted comedy to armchair theory to the occasional cage match debate with a leftist. Haas sees himself as a Marxist theoretician in the core of his own idiosyncratic brand of Marxist-Leninism. The reactionary thought. His blend of the idiosyncratic brand of Marxism thought is the reactionary thought of the Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin, an anti-Marxist, who explicitly says he wants to use Marxism as a fifth column in his book, The Fifth Political Theory, and see that in chapter 3. And I've discussed it and pointed out exactly where he says it. It's not even hidden. It's not implied. It's stated. Dugin is a master thinker who, most importantly, provides a strategy for thinking civilizational multipolarity, a term that Dugin had come up with. He got it from E.H. Carr and Hans Morgenthau, about multiple empires existing or coexisting, and the emergence of a post-unipolar, post-American dominated world scene, which has been talked about since Fareed Zakaria picked up Hans Morgenthau and E.H. Carr and fucking aught before Dugin did. None of this is unique to Dugin. Dugin Dugin varies from book to book. I've read a lot more Dugin than I talk about, and it's interesting what they don't cite by him. Dugin argues that war and violence are necessary to initiate a break from leftism and liberalism, like the futurists and the fascists before him. Dugin thus gives infrared a global perspective on the right aim to destroy leftism, and as a result, they frequently celebrate and embrace repressive authoritarian regimes such as North Korea. And they understand Putin's Russia to be in line with the wider socialist and communist vision, even though Putin goes after Lenin on a regular basis. That's me adding that. In the last 2 years, Haas has teamed up with Jackson Hinkle, a shady social media provocateur who mysteriously grew his followers on X following the Al-Aqsa flood on October 7th, 2008 to over 2 million. Haas and Hinkle have outlandish squabbles with leftists that they become parodies of themselves. They openly celebrate Stalin. They advocate for a return to patriarchal authority. They refer to LGBTQ as social fascist movement. In the rise of MAGA communism, they make it clear that today's LGBT pride, our 2020 BLM protest, have more in common with the mass politics of fascism than today's MAGA movement. All of these end up degenerating to mass. I mean, that's funny. I guess they were just saying that they are mass politics, which I might even take some aim at this point. All these provocative and chaotic politics have, unsurprisingly, led the left to view Hinkle, Haas, and MAGA communism as best as a patriotic socialist movement defined only to tail the Republican Party, but at worst they are viewed as a fascist right-wing movement. I do think they share a lot of. I think Dugin is explicitly post-fascist, so and that way, Haas is engaging something like Ernst Nidek and the Nazbol in the 1930s, but they're not really the same thing. Unless you have chosen to go full grill pill and gone offline, the parasocial left is inescapable. I mean, a lot of the liberal left has basically sheltered itself on Bluesky. And while I like Bluesky better actually as a medium than I like X, the politics there are just as myopic, and it is sort of increasingly a little bit like True Social for liberals. If you are on the online left, MAGA communist movement went heavily into your picture at some point. My engagement with MAGA communists started when I treated Dugin's appearance with Haas and Hinkle in Russia. I pointed out a series of contradictions in the Marxism espoused by MAGA communists. Although my criticisms were relatively mild, the guerrillas swarmed me with a passionate defense of Haas. They've done it to me too. One thing led to another, and they taunted me to debate him, going so far as to justify that bound from the debate, I would only confirm that I was a soy leftist professor. I'm not a professor, so you can't accuse me of that. What I pointed out to the MAGA communists is that they resemble a dependent group, as Bion theorizes it. We recall the fundamental weakness of the dependent group is founded on its members' reliance on the alpha leader, an idea that's not even bounded in biology. Bion helps us look, I mean, it's weird that leftists would argue for an alpha leader, by the way. Bion helps us locate the fatal flaw of the dependent group in a way that the aggression persists among its members due to their reliance on the leader. Their reliance is ambivalent. While the leader is celebrated as the only one who can enact the alternative to the winner-loser reality of liberal society, the fact is that the liberal is taken up to be the only one who can perform, and the winner ends up stunting the independence of each member. Yeah, it's these dynamics are not new to the left and not unique to MAGA communism, though. I mean, most sectarian Marxist groups work this way. I hate to tell you that, but it's true. That's why I'm a trans-sectarian, is because I see these dynamics in sectarian groups all the time. So I decided to engage with MAGA communists and to appear on Hazard's show. The event was live streamed on Hazard's Kick channel, an alternative to YouTube for dissidents on the right and the left, mostly the right. Death threats were exchanged between infrared guerrillas and the pro-trans and LBD2 leftists. One day before the debate, a close friend of mine alerted me to a meme that Infrahaz had promoted during Pride Month, which advocated the extermination of gay people. As a result of this tension going into the debate, I felt obliged to address the importance of Marxists to embrace LGBTQ people in the name of common dignity, and for me, bodily autonomy, in the name of de-intensifying the culture war aggression. I open with this message because it's essential for Marxists to stand for the rights of LGBTQ people, and to do so does not mean that we somehow have been co-opted by liberalism. I mean, that would be accusing, Cuba and China being co-opted by liberalism, which might do, but not for that reason. In their increasing embrace of the same, which both have. Bourgeois cultural war, politics, or leftism. It's not to say they were great on in the past; they weren't, but still. But more importantly, I wanted to argue that because MAGA communists treat the online space as a battlefield with immense political space, they treat online politics as more real than offline politics, which I think is insane. I actually do think that's delusional. However, when death threats are made and violence is encouraged, this theory is suddenly abandoned, and they end up backing away from the open embrace of violence and destruction because it would have actual consequences, which the online rhetoric kind of doesn't. Would Haas and the guerrillas want to be responsible for actual chaos and violence, or are they ultimately LARPing? I mean, I think a lot of people are ultimately LARPing. The good news is that it has ended up encouraging the guerrillas to refrain from violent provocations with LGBTQ leftists, which could be taken as a minor success and sufficient reason to justifying the debate. My rationale for taking part in this debate was influenced by the Marxist philosopher George Lukács, who argued that fascism is an irrationalist epistemology that strives on incoherent ideas. The Marxist sociologist John Bellamy Foster has argued today's left is witnessing a return of irrationalist theories. I would agree with that. And like Lukács before him, Foster locates this return of irrationalism in the rise of imperialist wars and monopoly capitalism. I maybe agree with that. I don't necessarily agree with Foster's definition of monopoly capitalism, but I do think there's a there. I actually hold to the earlier forms of monopoly capitalism proposed by Bukharin and Lenin, which I do think the monthly review school actually does slightly alter. Baran and Sweezy don't actually have the same theory as Lenin and Bukharin. Anyway, that's beyond the scope of the day. That would take me hours to go into why I think that. That does not mean I think that there's no value in the thinking. Obviously, I like Foster. I've had him on my show. Although I do not think that the MAGA communists are fascist in any clear sense of the term. I don't either, by the way. I want to be clear on that. I'm not sure I know what fascism today would look like. Everybody calls everybody fascist, and I think the reason why fascism is invoked so much is it's the one time that anarchists, liberals, and Marxists are on the same side for a very brief period of time in the Popular Front. Trotsky is not so much, but that this has a universal appeal, but also it's misleading because one, they weren't all on the same time except at the very end of the war, and two, we all know where it actually went. It's not like that communists ultimately came out on top in the Popular Front. Historically, that's kind of undeniable at this point. Although I do think many communists are fascists in any clear sense of the term, I do believe that their music poses a danger to development of Marxism in our time. A Marxism that trades in openly chauvinistic, violent frameworks and that theorizes Marxism as a warlike practice in the service of New Age imperialist warfare is a rationalist. If successful, I would like a definition of irrationalism from Lukács a little bit more spelled out in this article. If it is successful, it will only further divide the wider left from Marxism at a time that the practices of Marx and Engels are desperately needed for reforging and organizing the working class. If irrationalist ideas are not openly debated and critiqued, they will only fester. And if they are only just shot down or mocked, they actually make a mutually constitutive feedback loop, which is why I don't generally engage in this kind of stuff. I don't see the point in it. It's not that like I won't discuss it or I think, oh, we should never platform this stuff. It's more that I don't see the point in forcing people back into the raws, into their fight-flight responses, and thus their fight-flight groups. Since my debate with Haas, the MAGA communist movement has fused with Midmaster Marx Institute to create the American Communist Party, and a few other groups, actually, I think. The formation of the ACP has led the guerrillas to professionalize, and like Jordan Peterson has this frequently admonished guerrillas to take active roles in their community. Probably good, actually. Those people that do some stuff in their community probably would be terrible, but all kinds of groups encourage that. I wish leftist groups encourage it more, or Marxist groups. I don't even know what the left is these days, but still. The left seems to be liquidated at this point. But their professionalization, the ACP continues its daily all-out assault on leftism, which seems to only reinforce the culture war inertia of bourgeois politics. Yep, the culture war distractions dominate. And when people get sucked into that, I really worry about them. This is a difference I have with a lot of people, is I do think we have to have answers to social reproductive issues, which are largely in the culture war. And I don't think we can just tell liberal and democratic talking points. But I don't agree with just not tailing liberal and democratic talking points by tailing conservative or reactionary ones. I know. The Baudrillardists will pretend that I have some absolutist notion of reactionary and then play that it's relative and something event, something mystification, blah, 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 mystification of words. But the Baudrillardists are another group of people I'll deal with later. The myth of the political usurer is one of the great stumbling blocks obstructing the advancement of socialist politics in America. For the perspective of bourgeois politics, it must be internalized as reality. But when it is internalized, workers see their conditions as the immediate result of their performance in the market as success or failure, and thus they hope to succeed. They thus are encouraged to see themselves almost in petit bourgeois terms, even though they're not. This sparks a circle of resentment within the alpha fight or flight communities inevitably brought up to organize collective dissatisfaction. Although I do want to point out that none of these groups tend to have working class people as their leadership, at least by their own definitions of working class. We'll come back to that. I mean, by the definitions of working class, most of the people who are parasocial streamers are rentiers themselves, which is why I don't factor myself as like a working class leader or anything like that. I don't use that hyperbole. Because what's the fucking point? It wouldn't be true. I am from the blue-collar working class. My mom didn't become a nurse until I was 19. My stepfather was a mechanic. My father was borderline lumpen. And I grew up what would today be called lower middle class. Although later on, my family did achieve middle class status. Effectively, as I've said many times, I've gone up 2 social classes on the American social class spectrum above them. I am white collar all my life. I mean, I've done blue collar jobs. I've worked in loading docks and done some other things. I've also worked as a corrections officer, and as a pizza cook, and I've done a bunch of different jobs in my life, actually. But since I was 27, 28 years old, I have done intellectual labor. And sometimes I've done other labor on the side, but that's mainly what I've done. And so I don't claim to speak for the blue collar working class. And if I am part of the working class, I am in an elite subsection of it. And I don't deny that. I would call myself at best a labor aristocrat. Right. And I know that about myself. I think everybody needs to come to terms with where they are in the class spectrum, at both their habitus, the class that they come from, and what they do, which actually defines their class. I do think your habitus is important. There is a difference between someone who's coming out of the working class and someone who's a fail son and going down into it and stuff like that, or someone who chooses to go down into it. I've actually known people to do that. My stepfather did it, actually. But these are things that need to be wrestled with. And the liberal way of talking about this solely in terms of income is increasingly distorting. Although income is important in our society, I don't want to make it sound like it isn't, but it doesn't always make class obvious, because wealth, inherited wealth, familiar wealth, stuff that sometimes we bring up when we talk about race, but we don't talk about it internal to race in liberal circles all that much, even though it's still just as true, really matters. Can you go home and live with your parents for months, or do they not have the room for you? Could they not support you? Et cetera, et cetera. All right. Anyway, back to this. This sparks a cycle of resentment. The alpha fight or flight communities inevitably sprout up to organize this collective disaffection. The left must never affirm this coding of people according to success or failure. I don't know about that. I do think we have to talk about failure, but I don't think we need to talk about it in terms of the market. I think you need to talk about it in terms of social responsibility. You can fail to be socially responsible. To do so is to affirm a violent competitive structure of social reality, which is ultimately conceals the reality of class struggle. Yeah. Economic struggles are not about individuals, but individual social responsibility does matter. All right, anyway. If the left does not address the psychic alienation that comes from automatically coding people as losers, they will have only frozen the class struggle, not advanced it. Because they've created a highly irrationalist account of Marxism, the first step is challenging movements like MAGA communism is to take them seriously at the level of their ideas, and not immediately discount them. Which is why I'm so careful. I don't want to do that. I do read their ideas. I disagree with a lot of them, but I don't want to get into what, like, finally parsing the movement with a comb. But I do think that we have to admit that even if it's a viral thing it may be a fringe movement, maybe even partially bot turfed, because everything on Twitter is. It does have real appeal to people, and we have to talk about why. The best antidote to addressing movements like MAGA communism is not to dismiss them as losers, for to affirm the myth of the loser is going to strengthen it and thus foment even more reaction, aka this mutually constitutive view of the insider-outsider dichotomy that's built into these fight or flight groups becomes exacerbated. But I do think we should be careful with just thinking of stuff like MAGA communism that does this. The sectarian Marxism in general has a tendency to have this structure, which is why it's often said to have a cultic structure. Obviously, because it usually empowers individuals who often cannot and do not achieve what they say they're going to achieve in general society. The revolution is always postponed. Their failures are never their own, etc., etc. But why are you putting so much faith in an individual in the first place? When I critique Bonapartism and our overdependence on figures like the president as a flaw in our thinking, why would I encourage it in social movements? You shouldn't either, I don't think. But I wouldn't lose a lot of sleep over MAGA communism ideology as an ideology. I'd lose a lot of sleep over the world that has produced a left and a set of incentives that makes this kind of stuff more and more attractive. Fix the core, not the symptom. Fix the disease, not the manifestations of the disease. Protect your peace, like and subscribe. If you like more, hit the bell. Thank you, Daniel, for writing this. I don't agree with every bit of the framing. As I went through, I had to nuance a lot of it, but I think it's a pretty good account. In fact, I would stretch this out more and maybe apply it. One, I'd talk about, if I was Daniel, I would talk about how Nietzsche's not, I don't think Nietzsche's a liberal. I do think Nietzsche is copacetic to this period of liberalism, and it shows up in post-Marxism for a reason. And that came out of a lot of, in France in particular, that came out of a lot of the failures of the French Communist Party. Just like Lacerdo stuff, I think needs to be read in the context of the failures of the Italian Communist Party and Eurocommunism collapsing. Which Lacerdo was not a Eurocommunist. Some people said I asserted he was. I don't think he was, but he was in a Eurocommunist party. And he's kind of the dingest, the dungest response to that, you know. And it's very particular. You know, I think demonizing Lacerdo is to remove him from his context too. And some people are apt to demonize him and dismiss him. I wouldn't do that. But I'm not going to endorse everything he says because I don't think his context is ours anyway. Similarly, I think Nietzsche's reappropriation in liberalism via Walter Kaufmann served a very particular purpose that even Kaufmann and co didn't see. And I think we need to think about that. I think Daniel's book is an attempt to do that. His book, To Think Like a Parasite, how to read like a parasite. Excuse me, I have it back there, which I'm going to discuss sometime. It's not on my book cycle behind the Patreon yet, but maybe I'll even do it for the main channel. I tend to lose subscribe. People don't follow the things that last more than 4 episodes. So anyway, this has been long enough for Radical Engagements. Thank you. Protect your peace. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. There's more behind the Patreon. There's thousands of hours of material at this point. I mean, there's thousands of hours of material for free, but there's thousands of additional hours, including my entire archive of the stuff I've done for the last 14 years. If I can get a hold of it, it's there. So like and subscribe, hit the bell, protect your peace.